Hey Chelsea, why are we making a podcast about death?
Hi Fiona, good question. Two ladies talking about death. It's because we're worried women are not talking about these issues enough.
That's right, UK Parliament's debating laws on assisted dying, the results of campaigning all over the world for governments to take the pretty momentous step and offer death to their citizens. We really want you to join us as we learn why this is a huge issue for women. Today we're hearing more about eating disorders and assisted death from Dr Catherine Cook Cottone.
Imagine that your daughter just goes on a diet. Then they start getting feedback because of the thin ideal. And during this time in your daughter's life, they were applying to college and life felt really overwhelming and out of control. The disorder gives this person a bit of a sanctuary, a sense of safety, an illusion of control. And the disorder, it has this tremendous capacity to self-protect. It takes over your kid. It defends itself against the treatment provider. I've watched people mortgage their houses 3 times for treatment while they lose their kid. And then to have the sense that there could potentially be a doctor out there somewhere that would come and say, come here, I'll give you this. Listen to the story of this family where they all hugged and held hands as she gently died and passed away, with her parents loving her, suggesting that that's the pathway as opposed to the narrative of recovery, the narrative of doing the hard work it takes. It's a lot, overwhelming, but that's the road of healing and health. That's the beautiful story where you watch your kid finally meet their dreams in a decent body weight. That's the narrative. Not hugging while your daughter dies at the 3rd dose.
I can't bear the idea that doctors already in the UK pursue terminal anorexia as a diagnosis, who will be permitted to suggest this to young women, to propose this story of control. Hey Chelsea.
Hi Fiona.
So nice to talk again, and really pleased with the response we're getting to our first episode on assisted death on women. I was worried to start with, and having spoken to you and heard what you said about women with eating disorders being given assisted death in countries where this is lawful, I thought we need to talk more about this. And also because you're going to Parliament this week, so by the time people hear this episode, you will probably have given evidence to the MPs, and hopefully they will have engaged really constructively with this pretty terrible outcome that we need to prevent, which is women with eating disorders being given assisted death.
Yeah, I'm really happy to be back and to have an opportunity to go more deeply into the question around how and why assisted dying laws have been used to help people with eating disorders in their lives. And I could think of no better person to bring on to talk to us about this than my co-author, Dr. Catherine Cook Cottone, who is in New York at the University at Buffalo, which is part of SUNY, and is a registered psychologist and a researcher specializing in eating disorders. Catherine, if we could talk a little bit today about the study that we did last and what we found, and help people that may be very new to this issue understand, because in my experience, many people are just shocked. They just can't believe that a doctor would think it was okay to help a person with an eating disorder end their life.
It started with a text that Chelsea texted me when she ran across an article where the authors proposed a diagnosis of terminal anorexia and then described assisted dying as a possible someone who has this terminal anorexia could do as a treatment option, essentially. And she just wondered if it was a legitimate research article because it was so shocking. And someone who works in the field, I just was like, what is this? What is happening here?
I couldn't believe it had been published because it was an article that described the deaths of 3 people in their 30s with anorexia. One of the authors had been the treating physician for each of the patients, and 2 of the patients, or the people, human beings we're talking about, had been given lethal medications to end their lives. And the premise of the article, it built on this idea that has kind of circulated in the eating disorder field. And, in any academic discipline, there's these kind of controversies and very niche topics. But one of the ideas that's been circulating is this question of whether some people with eating disorders have a particular type or a form of the illness called a severe and enduring eating disorder. And I have to say it came out of a really well-meaning attempt to support people who had been struggling to get better for a really long time and had maybe even become very severe in their illness. But Catherine can probably say more about how poorly defined it is in the literature, and it's a very theoretical topic, but it emerged from that idea that there's a severe and enduring eating disorder. And it said, well, perhaps on top of that, there's also a terminal stage of eating disorders. A person with a severe and enduring eating disorder can become terminal. And if they do become terminal, then perhaps one of the most compassionate things we can do is give them medications to end their lives swiftly and without pain.
And so at the point this paper was being written, the people in the paper, the patients in the paper were dead already.
That's right.
And we went to an academic conference on eating disorders, and there was a panel addressing this issue. And it was while we were watching the panel that we realized this alignment with what was being proposed in terms of this diagnostic category, and that it would make a pathway, a legal pathway for assisted dying for individuals with eating disorders, because there wasn't one currently.
So it sounds like this paper was almost crafted so that it very conveniently fits the definition of terminal illness that would qualify you for assisted death, even where you only can access that for terminal illness. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, I would not want to go as far as to say that I knew what the intention of the authors was when they wrote the paper, but I think what was remarkable and really striking is that the diagnosis was crafted in a way that the criteria seemed very similar to some of the legal eligibility criteria for assisted dying. So just to give you an example, the fourth criteria is a consistent, clear expression by an individual who possesses decision-making capacity, that they understand further treatment to be futile, they choose to stop trying to prolong their lives, and accept that death will be the natural outcome. So it was the first time I think Catherine and I had ever seen in a paper presenting a psychiatric diagnosis, the criteria that would be used to diagnose that person, including, for example, decision-making capacity, which is not something you usually see. You know, if we're talking about schizophrenia, you wouldn't see that as one of the criteria. You might see it in the mental health, you know, in how they engage with treatment, or the fact that they accept that death will be the natural outcome. That was a very strange criteria to be using to diagnose someone with a. It did set off some alarm bells. It didn't seem to have a whole lot of evidence behind it, and then also, you know, when you can point to an academic paper and say, oh, see, anorexia is terminal, it makes it a lot easier to say that a person is eligible for assisted death.
And this obviously alerted you to what was potentially happening. But is this an isolated case, or is this actually thinking that is much more widespread?
Well, we didn't know at that moment. We had to do the research. So it wasn't until several months later, we Catherine and I both went to a professional conference and heard this talked about there and heard it talked about in other countries. So it was very clear that it wasn't just one doctor doing it. And when we went to look at the research, we realized that there was no study that was trying to make an estimate of how many people had died, what were the medical reasons that physicians had given to justify assisted death for an eating disorder. And so it was really clear that we didn't even have it. We kept hearing people say, oh, it's only just a few deaths. It's just a few people. Don't worry, it's just a few girls with anorexia that had really bad eating disorders. We wanted to find out how many and what were the medical rationales given. Was this something that was aligning with scientific evidence or not?
What were the key findings from your research paper people need to know?
Well, one of the things as we were digging in was that these were women. So that is concerning.
Yeah, all women.
Yeah.
The other thing was that it was happening at a much larger scale than we anticipated, and we highly suspect that we don't have anywhere close to the numbers. Like, just trying to get the lack of transparency and the lack of actual record keeping when we're talking about jurisdictions giving physicians permission to help people die, right? So this is death, and yet it was very hard to access records, and then the records were not complete in a way that could help us analyze the data to see what the trends were.
Yeah, so when we undertook this, it's called a systematic review, and it's where you try to look at all of the available peer-reviewed papers, so scientific papers that have been done on it, and we looked at that, and there was fewer than 5. So we went, okay, that's not enough. And so then we turned to government records. evidence. And we had to, any type of research study, you have to define, the bounds of where you're going to do the research. So the first thing we thought is, well, let's just focus on countries where assisted death is legal for mental illness. And so we looked at the Netherlands, Switzerland, Luxembourg, and Belgium. But then we were aware that there were cases in the United States that had been reported in the peer-reviewed literature. So cases where people with eating disorders had been described as terminal and thus eligible for assisted death. So we looked at 11 states in the US. Naively, I think at that time, I look back and I think, oh, I was so naive. I thought, oh, let's not look at Canada and let's not look at Australia or New Zealand, because of course, it's not legal for mental illness there, so it wouldn't happen there. So unfortunately, we did not look at government records in those countries and can't make any claim as to whether there were deaths or were not deaths. But the key numbers is that we identified at least 60 people with eating disorders have died by assisted death, where the qualifying condition was an eating disorder. A third were in their teens and 20s. They were between the ages of 18 and 30. These were people with decades of life ahead of them.
Young women.
Yes,
girls,
women.
Young women. Yeah.
Exactly. All were women. I mean, so of the 60, we were able to identify 19 that had full case reports where you could actually read about the person and the circumstances that led to their death. 89% were depressed, were described as chronically depressed. 37% had previously attempted suicide. 58% were described as chronically suicidal with active suicidal ideation. And 95% had more than one psychiatric disorder.
37% had PTSD.
Yes.
These are like girls, young women, mostly women who have a history of trauma, who have other psychiatric diagnoses, who have been suicidal, and they are then ushered into suicide by physicians. Is that fair?
The physician would probably say, no, it wasn't suicide. It was assisted death. It was, and they would try to draw that distinction between an assisted death and a suicide. But when someone is actively suicidal and their physician gives them lethal medications to end their life, it's very hard to draw that clear line. Just to go back to answer your other question is, I was shocked at how hard it was to get the data. So many people have characterized our study and said, oh, well, there's only 60 people with eating disorders. This is really, every one of those human lives is precious. One person with an eating disorder dying in this way is too many, in my opinion. But I would also say, I say at least 60. We found 60 documented cases, but we were only able to look at a fraction of the cases that are out there. Most of the cases we couldn't rule out eating disorders. Even in the Netherlands, which has the best record keeping of any country, we were only able to look at 19% of psychiatric cases and determine what the diagnosis was. There were 81% of the cases with that were for psychiatric reasons. We couldn't determine whether it didn't tell us what the diagnosis was. And then the last thing I'll say about that is in the US specifically, we were able to confirm that people with eating disorders, that anorexia had been listed by name as a qualifying terminal condition for assisted death in 3 US states, California, Colorado, and Oregon. But in California and Colorado, there was no mention of anorexia in any of the annual reports. So if a physician had not decided to tell the world that it had happened, we would have no knowledge that those cases existed. And we still have no knowledge of how many cases have occurred in those 3 states, because the state agencies have confirmed that cases have occurred, but they will not confirm how many. So I can say that there are at least 3 cases, but I cannot tell you how many.
And I want to go back to the you said, like physicians ushered, and I don't think that's the like ushering, but it's that when you are in a state of starvation, which anybody who's not eating for 2 weeks enters into a shift in how you process your emotions, your thoughts, and your biological processes. They shift so that you are different and you are representing the starvation in everything you say or do or think. So who's talking? Your starvation, your mental illness, or you, right? So we don't know. I think that, saying it, a physician ushered, it's that a person starts thinking, this is what I want. And they often will seek out, like in some jurisdictions, there are places where you can go and have the evaluation and get the medication. So the patient themselves will seek out the doctor that will do this, right?
Yeah.
So just to balance it in terms of, it's not necessarily a physician seeking out patients to, give them scripts, but that when you're sick in this way, you're struggling in this way, and you are becoming suicidal as a symptom of depression, your starvation, all that, then you'll start to pursue ways out.
I would also add that in at least one case in the US, the physician suggested it to the patient, at least as it was documented in the literature. So that relates to the UK bill that's being considered, because there is legally allowed that a doctor can bring it up with the patient. And I think my worry about that is that when a person is in distress, especially for a person with an eating disorder who may be very malnourished, and we know malnourishment is associated with brain atrophy and cognitive distortions, depression, suicidal thinking, that to bring up the idea that perhaps a quote, good death is a better option. If you don't want to gain weight, if you don't want to engage in treatment, perhaps I can put you in hospice and we can give you a medication so that your death isn't too painful. That's a person in a very vulnerable state. And we don't have to call that coercion, but we might call it undue influence.
Yeah.
It's certainly a very scary idea to be proposing that to such a vulnerable person.
I mean, it sounds like when you have an eating disorder and you are starving, you can't make decisions in the way that you would when you're well. But yet there's no brakes on this. There's no, it almost qualifies you.
Yeah. I mean, the crux of it comes down to this idea of what is, does a person in the throes of an eating disorder, in the throes of starvation, have the mental capacity, has what they call like authentic or genuine decision-making capacity, where it's coming from who you are as a person, as opposed to a reflection of the mental illness that you're acutely suffering from. And that's a really important piece, that eating disorders are still considered acute. It means that you have them and you get better. Most people have an eating disorder and get better. So this moment in your life that will pass, right? And that if you're refed, you will think differently. You will understand the problem differently. You'll respond differently to an assessment, right? So in these acute, we know all this from the research. In those moments, that's not when you would make a decision to die. We would make a more authentic, genuine decision based on what's good for our soul, our heart, our friendships, our relationships, if we were not starving, if we were not acutely mentally ill.
95% of the cases that we reviewed stated with certainty that the patient had capacity to end their life. And in 42% of those cases, previous physicians had rejected the person's request. So, and that not necessarily on the basis of capacity, but for whatever reason. So we do have doctors that might have said, I don't think this is a good idea, perhaps because of what Catherine just alluded to, you're depressed, you're in a malnourished state, perhaps this isn't the right time. But the mental capacity safeguard is not enough. It's not enough to deal with this situation. Because with capacity, we're talking about, can the person understand information? Can they reason with information? Can they appreciate how that information applies to themselves or their circumstances? Or here in the UK, can they balance and understand and retain that information? And then can they communicate it? People with eating disorders, even at very, very low weights and very malnourished states, can often pass that test because it doesn't just affect them cognitively, it affects them emotionally. And a mental capacity test isn't often designed to ask the question, is the wish to die emerging from desperation, depression, past trauma? And also, if this person gets better, might they regret it later? Might they regret the idea that they wanted to end their life later? So I think mental capacity is a very important safeguard, but it comes with a high degree of subjectivity in how physicians assess capacity, and it certainly doesn't rule out the potential that mental distress may be driving the wish to die.
I mean, in my layman's terms, mental capacity that will not stop women with anorexia from being given assisted suicide in the UK.
Right. And the way that both Chelsea and I work with preventing and treating eating disorders has to do with reintegrating you with your body, right? Like bringing your body back into the picture. So it looks like a parent. I would call it like a parent, like cognitive capacity. This a parent, but that all of the thinking is concept driven and aligned with the disorder. So, and abandoning the body, abandoning the heart, abandoning relationships, which are, when it comes down to thinking like, why am I glad I'm alive? When you ask people like, what are you here for? And it's like the heart stuff and the relationship stuff and the, your reasons for being, and all of that stuff gets abandoned in eating disorder psychopathology. Like that's part of what happens is you abandon your reasons why. You isolate yourself from your friendships. The starvation causes you to feel like you're not worth anything. Like some patients even think I'm not good enough even for treatment. I don't deserve treatment. Shame, guilt, these emotions start to be part of day-to-day life because of the disorder, because of the starvation, right? Yeah. And now is that a place from which you should decide if you should live or die when you've completely abandoned all the things that we talk about why we live, right?
Can I, at this point, I would just love to read from the research paper that we mentioned, which is where this doctor in the US was proposing a terminal anorexia diagnosis, and she recommended one of her patients for assisted dying. I've read a lot about assisted dying in the last few months, but I've been really shocked when I'm reading academic papers, particularly that people, like, you're talking about something so serious like killing people. I mean, let's be honest, like killing people. But people use this bare, unemotional, rational language in the papers they write and a lot of jargon. I think what the writers are doing is they're trying to sound rational and sciencey, but actually they almost coach themselves and coach the rest of us into thinking that you shouldn't respond emotionally to someone being given death. And I think that's wrong. But I was so struck when I read this paper that we're talking about, where this doctor does use emotion. And this is what this doctor said. This patient repeatedly told her family that she didn't want to die. She didn't want to miss out on future time with her family, friends and niece and nephew, but she just couldn't continue to exist this way. The emotional pain and anxiety were unbearable. She couldn't live a normal life, and she felt that her body was being too destroyed to recover. Her parents believe that in her last month she was trying to die naturally by barely eating, reducing her fluid intake and walking for hours daily, even when she had to sit down to catch her breath. She stopped driving and carried identification in case she collapsed. She fainted at home several times in the week before her death, including the night before she died. On the day she took the maid prescription, she stayed in bed, was at peace, and spent time talking with each parent and her brother. Together as a family, they reminisced, laughed, cried, and had their hug circle, as they'd called it, since childhood, and felt surrounded by love. Her parents each held a hand, and her brother sat right next to her, and during the 3 doses of the medicine, taken over an hour, she was comfortable and conscious. Within 10 minutes of taking the final dose, Jessica closed her eyes, and her breathing slowed. Jesus.
Yeah. When I hear that story, I imagine people may be thinking, gosh, that's some crazy stuff happening over there in America. It's a good thing it never happens here. And I mean, I have a quote that is not that different from a court of protection case that was heard just last year of a patient with anorexia. And she was brought to the court of protection because essentially physicians presented this dichotomy. Either she's going to be restrained and sedated and force-fed, or we have to just send her home and let her die. And the quote is, "Her prognosis is poor. In the view of the treating physician, as well as her low weight, he identifies a life expectancy of less than 6 months. She expresses a wish to die, but also with some frequency, a wish to live." She was described as having low mood and thoughts of suicide. So It's not that far. Like it seems like a very extreme case, but we are seeing cases like this already here in the UK. And fortunately, it's not an option for physicians to offer lethal medications to these patients at this moment. But what we are seeing is a judge saying, well, even if she lacks capacity, I don't think it's a good idea to restrain and force feed her. And we've seen judges acknowledge that sending that person home and not continuing with treatment will likely end up in their death, and choosing to do that because it's presented as this dichotomy. Either they're restrained and force fed or they're sent home, and not seeing that there is a whole array of treatment options in the middle, and that dichotomy shouldn't be forced on any human being.
Obviously, treatment for these women is something that's difficult, it's complicated, and there is challenge in it, but that death is presented this sort of settling of ease, this wonderful embrace of death, that you can finally be at peace. And I find that, like, I actually don't have the language to be able to describe how I feel about it, that young women, possibly with a history of mental health issues, with trauma, with neurodiversity, who've got into an eating disordered state and are struggling to get better again, would in fact be supported into death and it be viewed as something positive.
What's really fascinating is that in these cases, there's a case from the Netherlands, the Dutch sample, and it's case 2015-89, where this woman was older, and had complicated case presentation, and comorbidities or other disorders along with the eating disorder, including substance use, and essentially, had gone to ask for the assisted dying to this, the place where you go to ask for that in the country. And in order to do it, she was sober for 30 days by the time that the assisted diet. And I'm like, but that means that, like, she was actually making progress therapeutically. And so when the assisted dying offers hope, and that it's the hope in some of these cases, that's the hope of relief from their suffering. And so this idea of how our current access to treatment, how people feel supported in treatment, what treatments we have available, can they find hope there? Because the hope seems to be in these different cases what people are looking for. I'm hoping for a sense of relief from these symptoms that they're torturing me, right? And so that alone kind of says that if the only place people think they can find that is in death, that we've got a lot of work to do in terms of our whole provision of treatment, prevention, intervention.
You mentioned earlier that people generally recover from eating disorders.
Yeah.
They get better.
Most people do.
Yeah, and I, we talked beforehand, but I remember eating disorders being such a huge feminist issue when I was younger, and we've just stopped talking about it now. And I don't know if it's because people have got older and maybe forgotten that actually it's still really common among young girls and young women, or if the body positivity movement has made us all think the problem is solved. I mean, what's your sense, Chelsea? How much support might you get if you're a young girl or a woman to recover?
Yeah, that's a great question. The Eating Disorders APPG, which is a parliamentary group that raises awareness about eating disorders, actually just put out an exceptional report on what they call the right to health in eating disorders. I think it's all, eating disorders are often framed as an adolescent or a young people issue. So they highlighted that 360,000 children and young people have eating disorders in the UK.
In the UK, just now?
Yes.
Oh, man.
And that's just children and young people. In adults, it's 1.7 million adults in England alone. And I highly recommend that report, but one of the most striking things about that report, the big findings, is that we have a huge number of people, but only a very small percentage of them are getting treatment. So I believe there were close to, in adult eating disorders, about 20,000 acute hospitalizations for eating disorders last year. So that's going to be someone in a very severe place with their eating disorder. If you're going to an acute hospital, right? But only 1,200 admissions to specialist eating disorder units. So you have people being hospitalized for emergency situations, but then not actually transitioned into the eating disorder care they need and put into community services. The other big thing, and I think the only positive thing I can say about this whole assisted death and eating disorders thing that Catherine and I have accidentally stumbled into and developed a specialist expertise in, the only thing positive about it is that it's highlighted huge gaps in how we're caring for people and families affected by eating disorders. And one of the big ones in the UK, and I've seen this in court of protection cases, is that people are going into eating disorder treatment, that very few beds available, very limited staff available, and they're being, in the case of restrictive eating disorders, charged when they're really underweight. So we're talking BMIs of 12 and 13, which our national guidance says are life-threateningly low. Those are medical emergencies. That is a person with imminent threat to life. And they're being discharged when they're that thin. And I have to say from lived experience, when you're at that low of a weight, you don't even have a shot at recovery. You have to re-nourish the body and re-nourish the brain in order for the therapeutic modalities to work. And so I feel like we've got this situation where our system of care is almost creating fatal eating disorders by failing to treat them and then proposing the possibility of lethal medications then being available. And I should say, I know the framers of the bill, that is not their intention, but as the bill currently reads, there is nothing to prevent the way terminal illness is defined as being as interpreted as applying to eating disorders. And given the gaps in care, that is a very dangerous prospect.
Just the starvation alone from not eating, being at a non-restored weight, will affect how you respond to any of these questions in a way that wouldn't be valid. It would not be a valid assessment. So I can't imagine the safeguards you would have to put in place to make sure.
Yeah.
So the idea is, do I believe in assisted dying or not, or a person's right to die? And that question just can't be asked without saying, is it possible to put in sufficient safeguards? And in the case of eating disorders, which is where I can speak to with the most, education and background and my research experience, is that no, at this point, no, there isn't any possible way to put in sufficient safeguards.
I mean, and just if I can sort of summarise what you've both said, so we think there might be about 2 million people in the UK with eating disorders just now, and there are young women already being diagnosed as terminally ill with anorexia, and we have a terminal anorexia diagnosis which is percolating through conferences and research papers and highly trained people in the eating disorder field, which basically qualifies you for assisted death if you seek it out. And we also have doctors in this country who will be allowed to suggest it to patients. That just seems like we will have a headline, first anorexia sufferer to get assisted death in the UK almost immediately. It just feels there's no brakes on that at all.
What's remarkable and really stark about eating disorders is it's a mental disorder that has very clear physical consequences, very clear physical manifestations. And that is why it's so hard to safeguard and prevent it from squeezing through the door of terminal illness, because physicians will point to the physical consequences of eating disorders. I've seen terms like terminal malnutrition, end-stage kidney failure. And most of these consequences of eating disorders are reversible with adequate food intake. However, there are many physicians who do not believe that. And medicine, while we'd like to think that it's completely objective and 100% scientific and there's no subjectivity, these are physician judgments. Or, I should say that the bill has been proposed, I've realized this after our first episode, doesn't actually, as written, require 2 physicians. It requires a registered medical professional as set by the Secretary of State. So, the thought that a physician associate could be making that determination is really scary, but there's nothing in the bill as stands to prevent the physical manifestations of eating disorders from being cited as a terminal condition. That's one of many key loopholes.
Catherine, just before we finish up, so what have you had any good response from people who might have been, on the other side of the debate on this, who were the people sort of proposing terminal anorexia? Have they responded to your research with Chelsea and said, what, actually, we need to think about this in a better way?
No one's emailed me.
There's something...
It's one thing that we also, in terms of the notion of a person's autonomy and their rights and personal liberation and self-determination. I agree with all of that. I do. And the thing is that any kind of liberty, any freedom, has to have, like, we have to have safeguards. We have to have systemic and then, personal safeguards. And there are times when, and I know this from being a psychologist, I've had to have patients go inpatient until they can be well enough to keep themselves safe, right? I mean, that's just a part of being a psychologist. Is that something that I have to assess and do every week? So in an eating disorder units, this is something they're going to court all the time to have mandated care or mandated refeeding or against a patient's will. And that is part of what we have to do is sometimes as treating physicians and psychologists is to mandate the care until the person's well enough to be able to not be acting against their own best interest. And so, yeah, do I believe in agency and self-determination? When you are able to think, use your cortex on behalf of your entire being. But if you're isolating your cortex from your body and then having a cortex that is just serving your disorder and driving you toward your own demise and death, and right, as a psychologist, part of what we do is we don't let you do that, right? That's part of our job.
I think it is a noble goal to try to reduce end of life suffering and to increase options at end of life. 100%. We have to make sure that there aren't knock-on effects that mean that others are not harmed or even killed as a result of that individual expression. And that's a safeguarding issue. And I think it's at least important that we be asking the questions of whether that's a possibility. How many deaths are we okay with in the knock-on effects? Because if the safeguards fail once, if they just fail in one instant, that is one precious life lost that could have been lived for decades, potentially longer, with, children and jobs and family, and, every human being is a world to their own.
Yeah. Or time. Does that make sense?
Wow. It really does. And, there's waiting periods in assisted dying, but I think they can be waived, can't they, if someone's death is imminent?
Which, if you stop eating and drinking, it can be waived in this bill. So the waiting period can be waived to 48 hours if the person's death is predictable within a month. And so if a person is not eating and drinking, that is exactly, so yeah, it's a real, there's a whole nother thing. We'll have to do another episode on, Fiona, around the use of voluntary stopping of eating and drinking as a way of circumventing the terminal illness safeguard, which is happening.
Yeah, I think we've heard this, haven't we? That this is happening all over, and I just think we have to get serious about this. Before we finish up, Catherine, is there anything else that you would have liked to have said that we didn't, and I can sort of maybe edit it in?
Yeah, could you tell I was thinking of something? Well, because when you asked me if anybody said anything, and then I was like, no, but then yes, there was this essentially, and I don't know if it was how we heard indirectly but the idea was that we are somehow rushing to stop assisted dying, that we're making something more urgent than it needs to be. And what was fascinating is that the opposite is happening, that the assisted dying is getting pushed, and somehow our efforts to ask for a pause is what's being framed as overreactive, right?
Just to add to that, some of the feedback we received is, why do you want to stop assisted death for eating disorders? We don't really know that much about this yet. Shouldn't we, before we ban assisted death for eating disorders, shouldn't we kind of see how things play out a little bit?
Yeah.
I mean, our reaction was, well, shouldn't it be the other way around? Before you start bringing in assisted death for eating disorders, shouldn't you be really sure about the fact that, for instance, the person has an untreatable eating disorder, which we have no evidence for?
That there's such a thing.
Or make sure that every single treatment available that could reasonably have a chance of working has been tried. And just make sure that this is being done in a, I don't know, how do you do assisted death for eating disorders in a safe way? right now there's not even transparency around it, but it was actually the opposite. It was, whoa, slow down. Before you ban assisted death for eating disorders, let's just see how this plays out. I was like,
So what? So like
yeah.
people kill people first and then work out if it was a good idea
Right.
later.
We were trying to get different organizations to sign on to our statement and kind of saying like, right. And that was the feedback that we were getting for people who were reluctant to sign was like, aren't you rushing in? And we're in the opposite, right? Exactly the opposite, like slow. And all right, for me to get an intervention, and Chelsea and I have been doing this work with her program, Eat, Breathe, Thrive, in order to get something considered empirically supported and then utilized for prevention and treatment, you have to have multiple studies. You have pilot studies. All this goes to the institutional review boards, just like considered safe for patients. Then you have to do controlled trials, randomized controlled trials. This is all so expensive and so time consuming. It has to, and really with eating disorders, with the lack of funding for research, it's got to be a passion of the heart. And so you do all that just to do an intervention, proving it's safe. You know how long it's taken us to get people to even think it's safe to do yoga with people with eating disorders, and still in the NICE guidelines, it's considered not safe, even though we have empirical meta-analyses saying it's, there's been no harm documented, and then in fact it helps eating disorders and be part of treatment. That's taken decades to do yoga with people with eating disorders. But all of a sudden, you can just offer assisted dying when it
and I would add that even the lethal cocktails being used in the US have never been approved by any drug regulatory body, not the FDA. There's been no testing to ensure that they're actually effective in ending life. Many of the drug cocktails take many hours to end a person's life and can cause seizures, can cause jerking motions, can cause the person to vocalize. And so, and that's in I think in Oregon, it was 14.8% of cases had complications. So it really was a very reversed reaction. It was like, well, but before you put a ban on it, let's just see how it plays out. But not even the medications have been tested. And the last thing I think we heard was, I don't know if I want the law in my therapy room. So that was another piece of feedback. We don't know if we want to stop assisted death for eating disorders because then the lawyers might get it. And I'm like, the lawyers are already in your therapy room.
you people.
Okay, is this the slippery slope?
I mean, it's a slippery cliff. It's not a slope. It's a cliff. What shocked me about the slippery cliff is that it's not expanding through legal amendments. It's expanding through clinical interpretation and sometimes judicial interpretation. But it's just people looking at the law and looking at how the words on the page can be interpreted to expand to more and more people. And if the words are not watertight, which I would argue is very difficult to do without writing a 800-page legal document, it's going to expand because people will look for a way.
This is so important here because I am sure that Kim Ledbetter, who, as we say, definitely doesn't want people with eating disorders to be given death by this and now has to wrestle with this problem, she definitely doesn't want this to happen. But and she will say, Parliament will never expand this further. We will never expand it further. But it's not up to you. It's not up to you to deliver this. And people, once they're given that freedom, what you found is that they won't do the research paper first and then give people assisted death. They'll kill them, in polite language, they'll kill them and then they'll write the paper to tell everyone about it.
Maybe, if you're lucky. I would say we don't know if people with substance use disorder have been have undergone assisted suicide in the US. And in fact, we identified 25 cases between California and Colorado where malnutrition was listed as the qualifying terminal illness, but we don't know for sure if that was an eating disorder. So we couldn't include that in our 60 cases. Was that an eating disorder? Was it voluntary stopping of eating and drinking? Was it a person who had become malnourished because they were homeless and because they didn't have access to food? And I mean, there's a lot of questions there, but I think that Again, in some ways, we're lucky in the eating disorder world that someone wrote a paper about it, because this very well may be happening with alcohol use disorder. We do see liver disease listed in the terminal illness category. So it's, again, the canary in the coal mine.
And just that point, the voluntary stopping of eating and drinking, that's one of the things that the maid providers in Canada have included in their brochure of guidance for people in there who basically give their patients death, is that if somebody stops eating or drinking voluntarily, that qualifies them for assisted dying under the terminally ill bit in Canada, Canada's rules for assisted death.
That's true if you're in stage 4 cancer. Like, I lost my mom to pulmonary fibrosis, and she was in hospice, and I was there when she passed, and we did hospice, not assisted dying. But sure, that last week and sometimes 10 days before someone dies, they stop eating and drinking, and that's part of the death process. But in anorexia, it's part of the mental illness, and that is really different.
Catherine, what Fiona's speaking about there, though, is there in Canada, and I would add, Fiona, I've also found similar guidance by the American Clinicians Academy on MAID. Not guidance, but there is a publication that states, and I'm quoting, legally, there is nothing in the letter of the law in any U.S. state that explicitly prohibits voluntary stopping of eating and drinking as a terminal diagnosis to qualify for aid in dying. It remains a legal gray area. And the Academy confirmed that it would essentially eliminate the terminal illness criteria. So this is a situation where the MAID providers are actually recommending, if you don't have a terminal illness or you don't meet the criteria for terminal illness, if you stop eating and drinking, then we can deem you terminal because your death will be foreseeable in the near future.
It's true. And people don't care about eating disorders until either you have one or someone you love has one. And they had the highest mortality rate of any mental illness up until the opiate epidemic. And now they're second, but still a very complicated, painful disorder that you can recover from. But when you have someone with this disorder in your family, all of a sudden it matters, and it's very difficult. I've worked my whole career to get funding bodies to care about eating disorders, to get any systems of care to care about eating disorders, and it's very difficult because everybody thinks there's such a volitional part to it because of the cognitive capacity that has that apparent cognitive capacity that this person is just willfully, and just as equal willfully they could stop, and they can't and until they're refed, until they're balanced in many other ways that are physiological and psychological, do they gain the capacity to stop. So it's the illusion that you have control. I think that everyone thinks, oh, that person's they could get better if they wanted to, and so it has a bit of agency, we project agency onto people with eating disorders that simply isn't there.
Just one more question, sorry, before we finish up. I noticed in the paper it said this work is unfunded. So,
yes.
I mean, the one of the big campaign groups here in the UK spent like 2 million quid on their campaign in the last year, but you're doing work for free.
Yes, that is correct. No, there's no funding that, we could have identified for this. And we felt that it was a public safety issue that needed to be out in the public domain as soon as humanly possible.
I'm going to make sure we link to your paper and also this paper from the doctor in the US who was the one who had kicked it all off by providing death to some of her patients and defining terminal anorexia. I'm so grateful for the chance to speak to you both. You're both brilliant, and if you hadn't done your unfunded work on this, we wouldn't know what was happening and we wouldn't be engaging with this issue seriously, so it's incredibly important.
I want to say one more thing, sorry. I can edit this out. But I do want people, I think it's hard to make it real, but imagine that your daughter just goes on a diet, right? And maybe they were at a normal weight, but then they start getting feedback because of the thin ideal. And during this time in your daughter's life, they were applying to college and life felt really overwhelming and out of control. And you do have disorders like alcoholism and OCD in your family. And so there's this genetic predisposition toward eating disorders that's there. And with the combination of the restricting calories, the social pressures, the dynamic of leaving your family, the disorder gives this person a bit of a sanctuary, a sense of safety, an illusion of control, and it locks in. And then you watch as your beautiful, capable, passionate daughter becomes irritable and withdrawn and smaller and smaller. And then it often hides because it doesn't want people to see. So wearing clothes, and then you take them to the doctor, wait, and they're like, oh my God, right? We've got to get into treatment. And the disorder, part of it has this tremendous capacity to self-protect. It like takes over your kid, right? And it protects itself and it defends itself against the treatment provider. Treatment providers have to be very skilled at befriending the soul within the disorder, right? And the family's just watching their child fall away. I've watched people mortgage their houses 3 times for treatment. Well, they will lose their kid. And then to have the sense that there could potentially be a doctor out there somewhere that would come and say, come here, I'll give you this. Listen to the story of this family where they all hugged and held hands as she gently died and passed away, with her parents loving her and everyone rejoined. And that's that narrative, right? For one, isn't how it goes down. Maybe it did in that particular case, but that selling that narrative and suggesting that that's the pathway, as opposed to the narrative of recovery, the narrative of doing the hard work it takes to come back into your relationships, to have your hormones flood your body again, and have to negotiate sexual relationships in college. And it's a lot, overwhelming, and to deal with conflict you have with your parents. But that's the road of healing and health. And that's the beautiful story, where you watch your kid finally meet their dreams in a decent body weight while they laugh with their friends after at a pool party. Like, that's the narrative, not hugging while your daughter dies at the 3rd dose.
I can't bear the idea that there's doctors already in the UK who pursue terminal anorexia as a potential diagnosis, who will be permitted to suggest this to young women, to propose this story of control. You know, you can take control if you do this.
You can take control if you engage in your treatment, and it's really hard, but you can get better.
Hi, it's Fiona. Chelsea and I were so keen that we start to hear some really detailed debate on what assisted dying could look like here in the UK for women. We do not have big money funding, so if you'd like to support us, you can go over to our Substack and subscribe there, or you can donate to The Other Half on our website, theotherhalf.uk/donate. So grateful for this, and so grateful for you listening though. Thank you.